favorite things to do with movies is to analyze them and examine them. But we're not going in depth on why a movie's good or why a movie's bad. Today, we're going in depth on why a movie flopped. And I can already hear some of you asking, but what does a flop mean? Does it mean this?
Remember, he bruised his ribs in game 2, landed hard there. Bazemore to Horford, another bunny miss.
Yes, you would be right if you said that these were flops. But we're not talking about those today. We're talking about 2017's biggest box office bomb, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard of this movie, and I'm sure many of you haven't heard of this movie, but one thing I know for sure is that most of you, if not all, haven't seen this movie. And that is what I want to explore today, and maybe a annual little series that we can get going here is examining the biggest flop of the year. And this is something that I love doing, is just seeing why a movie fails or predicting its failure. And it's not good for the movie, obviously, they lose a ton of money, but it's so fascinating to see what bombs at the box office and what does gangbusters at the box office. And that's what I would like to explore today. Why did King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, fail so spectacularly? I mean, there were so many other movies in 2017 that failed, a la Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, which lost over $100 million, or The Promise, starring Christian Bale and Oscar Isaac, which had a $90 million budget and made $8 million worldwide. But all of these pale in comparison to King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. And what I want to explore today is this spectacular failure. I want to explore not the quality of the movie. In this video, that can be put by the wayside. In this video, I want to explore everything that makes this movie tick and everything that made this movie fail. If we just look at the movie, the one thing that jumps out is that this is another King Arthur adaptation, which immediately screams failure to me. Because if you look at the last King Arthur adaptation, which was more true to the myth of King Arthur, that movie completely failed. And that movie stars the talent of Mads Mikkelsen, Joel Edgerton, Stellan Skarsgård, Keira Knightley, Clive Owen, and Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four movies. This one stars Jude Law, Charlie Hunnam, and Eric Bana for one scene. So if that movie with an all-star cast failed, this one seems like it was almost destined to, no matter what the rest of the movie is. If you can't get yourself a good IP to bank your movie on, then you need to be incredibly original. And this movie, while maybe it is original in the context of the movie, it already has a bad IP that people don't care to see. There have been so many adaptations and reimaginings of King Arthur at this point that people are burned out. The last King Arthur movie was 13 years ago, and that movie failed. This movie is a Guy Ritchie meets Lord of the Rings movie, and it failed spectacularly. Again, because it already had a bad IP, just from the get-go. It was doomed from the start. As soon as the movie got greenlit, it changed hands like crazy. There was different directors attached, there was different script writers attached, there was rewrites, there was recastings, there was all kinds of things going on behind the scenes that mixed this movie up. And ultimately, it sort of shows with this cast list where it's like, there's a mishmash of different actors of different skill levels. You got A-lister Jude Law, up-and-coming A-lister Charlie Hunnam, and then it completely falls off from there. Eric Bana has like one scene. Cara Delevingne's sister is in it for like 2 scenes, and then there's just like nobody. It's such a strange mishmash of talent. I mean, talent isn't everything, obviously. If you can hire on a great director like a Christopher Nolan or a Martin Scorsese or a Quentin Tarantino, butts will be in seats. No matter what the movie is, no matter what the movie's about, no matter who's in it, people will be there to see it because of the director. And Guy Ritchie should be that director, really. A lot of people know him, a lot of people like him, I like him, and yet this still failed. And to examine Guy Ritchie, you have to look at his previous movies. I mean, the last movie he made, if we just take that one, Man from U.N.C.L.E., which came out a few years ago, failed too. And that one actually was a original, unique movie that many people didn't know beforehand. So at least that had something interesting going into it. It didn't have a straight up terrible IP from the start, and yet that one still failed. And that may just be because Guy Ritchie has a reputation for being a style over substance director. And while I'm okay with that, a lot of people aren't. A lot of people want to see something more. And I mean, of course I do as well, but sometimes style can make up for a lot. And I think Guy Ritchie is able to make up for a lot. But some people don't want to see that. And I think that's a big reason why Man from U.N.C.L.E. and King Arthur fell on its face.
How would you describe your own style?
So for me, it's just, that's what I do. Outside of that, it's impossible for me to sort of describe it.
But the movie gets greenlit, the movie has a solid cast, the movie has a solid director, and it goes into production. And from here, nothing can go wrong, right? Well, I mean, a lot can go wrong, but the biggest thing that does go wrong for this movie is that it has to be pushed back constantly until its release date in 2017. It was pushed back for over a year just because of delays in filming, of reshoots, re-edits, rewrites. Everything that you can imagine happened to this movie before it hit theaters. Which when somebody hears that, that's automatically a red flag. You hear that and you go, uh-oh, that's not a good sign. But, it could be good. It could be good. And then you see a trailer and you realize that it's PG-13 and you go, oh, okay, the PG-13, that appeals to a lot of people. That's definitely a marketing tactic, and it appeals to a big audience, a big demographic of people. Anybody can go see it realistically. But then you release the movie on Mother's Day weekend with no strong female leads and no love story of any kind. And now you have a real problem. So you delay the movie's release for a year, and then you release it on Mother's Day, where there are only 2 real female leads, and one dies in the first scene of the movie, and the other can barely speak English.
Hold my hand.
But not only is it bad that it released on Mother's Day weekend, it released in the middle of one of the hottest summers in a while. It released a week after Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and a week before Alien Covenant. And Beauty and the Beast and Furious 8 were still in theaters at that time. So your PG-13 demographic is spread out over 4 or 5 movies now. So how on earth do you think you could get anybody in the theater to see a King Arthur adaptation when you release it in the middle of the hottest weekend in May? Who thought of this? If you look at those other movies, Furious 8 made $1 billion. Beauty and the Beast made $1 billion. Guardians of the Galaxy made nearly $1 billion. And Alien Covenant, for an R-rated movie, also made a ton of money. Not $1 billion, it's not even close, but it made a lot of money. Your $170 million King Arthur adaptation releases in the middle of these titan behemoth blockbusters. What did you think was gonna happen? But okay, you ignore all these red flags, and you still release it in 3,700 theaters on Mother's Day weekend. And most movies today seem like they have to make at least their budget back or a little bit more in opening weekend in order to break even or make money. Movies like The Force Awakens made over 30% of the domestic gross total in their opening weekend. So the opening weekend's a big deal. And King Arthur's opening weekend was a complete failure. In its opening weekend, King Arthur made $15 million. And its production budget was $175 million. Now, there's a rule of thumb when you talk about budgets and advertising budgets. If you take the production budget, which was $175 million, and then you times that by 2, So 175 million plus 175 million. Then the number you have now is a rough gauge on how much money a studio spent on the movie. And as you can see, they spent $350 million on this movie. And it made $15 million in its opening weekend, which, if you look on Box Office Mojo, still accounted for 30% of its domestic gross total, which means that the movie made only $40 million domestically. So now if you're a Hollywood executive, you're staring at a $350 million movie that just made $15 million in its opening weekend. And you're staring at a huge loss, huge losses. So what do? You keep it in theaters as long as possible and hope that maybe the DVD run will get you some money. But unfortunately for King Arthur, the movie dropped over 50% in week 2 and week 3, and then dropped nearly 70% by week 4, which means it was basically making no money within a month. And not only that, but the movie dropped from over 1,000 theaters in 2 weeks, and then dropped another 1,000 after a month, which means it was in nearly a third of the theaters that it was when it opened. But the movie was saved from financial ruin by the foreign market. The foreign market made up for 73% of the worldwide total gross for King Arthur. 73%. It made over $140 million on a production budget of $170 million and an advertising budget, roughly, of $170 million, which means that this movie was looking at roughly a $200 million loss. And apparently this movie was a first in a 6-film expanded King Arthur universe that Guy Ritchie had planned, which probably isn't going to happen now. So if you look at all of these facts combined into one, it seems like this movie was basically destined to fail from the start. And it's unfortunate for Guy Ritchie. It's unfortunate for Warner Brothers. They lost $200 million roughly on this movie. So we will not be seeing a Guy Ritchie movie from Warner Brothers probably for a while. And we will probably not see another King Arthur movie from anybody for another, I don't know, 13 years. Maybe next year, once we find out the biggest flop of 2018, we'll revisit this series and discuss why whatever movie ends up being the biggest flop ended up being the biggest flop. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.